My name is Mark Johnson. I'm the Deputy Director of the South and East Network of Social Sciences, and I'm here this afternoon together with my counterpart in the Southeast Network of Social Sciences, Professor Ana Canyoto, who's the Deputy Director of the Southeast Network of Social Sciences, DTP1, and together Ana and I and our Director, Franciscos Filipeos, were conveners of this special SENSS Scholar Series on Generative AI and research. And we're really pleased today to be able to welcome our presenter, Dr. Harry Dyer, who is Associate Professor in Education at the University of East Anglia. Harry is a digital sociologist with interest in digital technologies, particularly social media and identity. He's also our chair of the interdisciplinary Digital Social Sciences Thematic Pathway for SENS DTP2. Harry was really supportive of this initiative to develop a generative AI and research series, and we're really very pleased to welcome him today to talk and share about theoretical perspectives on generative AI. And just before I hand over to you, Harry, just to say we are recording today's session, and just to invite you, please, to make sure that you've muted your microphone and that, at least for the presentation bit, you keep your videos off, but there will likely be opportunities at the end, I think, Harry, for potentially for questions at the end. So without further ado, over to you and welcome, Harry.
Hey, thanks, Mark. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks for the welcome, and thanks for everyone being here today. Yeah, as Mark said, I'm really interested in exploring these ideas of AI and its role in research and the ways in which it's changing modern research. And so I was asked to talk a little bit about some of the work I've done around AI, and I'll be talking a little bit about that. I've done a project exploring the ways in which young people think about AI, and we did it through a bunch of creative methods I'm going to talk about in a later session in this series. But for now, and cough down the mic, that's not very nice. For now, I'm going to talk about the theoretical implications of our thoughts around AI and the ways in which AI is changing modern social research. I do have something to keep me on track, so let me just figure out sharing my screen. It has been a while since I've used Zoom in this way. So I'm hoping you can all now see the screen that I'm sharing.
Yes, we can.
Lovely, thank you very much. So I'm going to start the presentation. So I was asked here to talk about like the theoretical perspectives on AI, the ways in which AI is changing social sciences in particular. And this is something that I've been really interested in my role for SENSS, in thinking about digital social sciences and what it can do as a field, as an interdisciplinary approach to research. So I'm going to try and guide myself through some of these discussions and questions today, hopefully in a way that's a little bit useful for you all. I wanted to start with this concept of sociological imagination a little bit, just so we can have a bit of a think about what social sciences does and the impact of AI for social sciences. For me, the importance of social sciences is that it sits in between a whole bunch of different fields, all trying to understand the impact of different aspects of our social world on ourselves, on communities, on practice, on a whole range of different topics. So my background is in education, that's what I lecture in, but I'm in a very interdisciplinary place, and I'm exploring education through the lens of technology and culture, and trying to understand the ways in which technology is shaping educational practice. I do a lot of this through the idea of a sociological imagination and through thinking of technology as a sort of socio-technical device. There's been a bunch of really interesting research exploring the idea of socio-technical understandings. I would point you all towards Ned Barker and Carrie Jewett in particular as two researchers who have done really interesting work around this in their look at robotics and its impact on modern work practices. But they talk in particular around the ways in which technologies are devices that are bound up in ways of seeing and thinking about the world around us. They talk about, in particular, this idea of what they call socio-technical imaginaries, which shape how we conceptualize the social world and the possibilities of the social world, which I think is a really useful way of thinking about technology, not just as a tool that we use, but as something that shapes our perception of the world around us. I'm going to read a quote from their work around robotics and workplaces. They say socio-technical imaginaries tend to reflect dominant social and political orientations to technologies. They are bound to and reproduced through organizational discourses, production practices, and social relations. What they're thinking about there is that it's not just what technologies do that's important, but how we think about them and with them and through them and despite those technologies. And I guess that's kind of where I wanted to place the discussion today, is thinking about how technologies change our theoretical thinking of the world. So I'm going to do this through the idea of a sociological imagination, which is a term I'm using Prezi, so it will zoom in and out quite a lot. Sorry if you feel a little motion sick as it's going, but stick with it. I promise there's a point to me zooming all over the place. So this idea of a sociological imagination has been sort of at the backbone of social sciences for quite a long time, of what we can do with sociology and with social sciences as a topic. It suggests that the job of a researcher is exploring our world and exploring the tensions in these realities. So which realities are present, which realities are suggested as a dominant reality, and which realities are sort of pushed to one side. And I think, as we've seen, in the last couple of years with the rise of AI, there's a particular perspective of the world that we're being asked to take. As I'll discuss throughout today, and I will make time at the end for discussion and questions, because I think it's worth talking this through from your perspectives and your fields. But I feel like we are asked as researchers to sort of uncritically accept the reality of tech companies, the ways they see the world, in sort of perpetualizing and normalizing their understanding of the social world. And I think we can choose to either take that position as a dominant position uncritically, or we can challenge and critically explore those perspectives of the world that AI suggests to us and that AI companies suggest to us. I think research is not only a space to sort of track and record realities, but to imagine or even demand different realities. And it's my hope that what we talk about today will give you some of the tools, perhaps, or some of the permission to challenge those realities with your work. All research is inherently political, every bit of research. And I worry, I guess, that we forget this with technology, particularly with AI technology, because it works on getting a massive data and then producing a seemingly unbiased result to us because of that massive data. But as we can see, for example, with the trade policies in America at the moment that seem to have been in some ways inspired by AI, or at least in line with the ways in which AI think about these things, it's inherently political. All of these questions, all of these answers are inherently political, as is any bit of research. So I would encourage you to think about the sort of ways in which we're expected to accept a certain reality. So sociological imagination is often referred to as the ability to see social structures that are continually recreating and reinforcing our current environmental conditions. I want to make a case here that it's not just an attention towards social structures, but a sort of call to action. It wasn't just an abstract concept, but a call for research and scholarship, and a way of using social science tools in a sort of perhaps activist sense. So Mills writes, the educational and political role of social science in a democracy is to help cultivate and sustain publics and individuals that are to develop, to live with, and to act upon adequate definitions of personal and social realities. to me, that positions social science research as a form of praxis, as something we should be applying in real life settings and real life spaces. So particularly important in education as a field, because we're quite close to practice of what happens in a classroom. But I think in general, it's an important position to start to take. And as the second quote here suggests, to fully realize the promise of sociology, students should come to an understanding of the sociological imagination that includes a sense of social responsibility. Taken that way, I think sociological imagination challenges us to shift our gaze of digital research away from just introducing technologies or measuring the impact of technologies to instead understanding and working with participants to reorganize, to address the socio-technical conditions they live under. It's my hope that perhaps we would encourage a little bit of that work through digital social sciences here at SENSS as well. So with all that in mind, with the suggestion that research is political, that the world is socio-technical, bound up in technologies, I kind of want to talk a little bit specifically about some of the research theoretical positions that are coming out about technology. In order to do that, I want to start with the idea of neutrality. I kind of mentioned this already, how neutral we can assume AI as being, but there's a whole bunch of theory behind this idea that no piece of technology is ever really neutral. I'm going to run you through a very quick potted history of some of the research and thinking about technology, but it goes back quite far, including the ideas of H.G. Wells. Now, often we tend to think of like theorizing about the internet to have started in, the internet age, but there's been a bunch of people always thinking about like the possibility of different bits of technology to change our perception of the world or to highlight specific realities. H.G. Wells in this book, The World Brain, which I think is a really interesting idea about the of a permanent world encyclopedia is what he positions in this, and he suggests that a permanent world encyclopedia would lead to, here's the quote written on his forehead, a common ideology based on a permanent world encyclopedia is a possible means of dissolving human conflict into unity. His suggestion was this idea that if we have more and more information, we get to a point where the world all sees everything the same way, and that we remove conflict and disagreement. We know it hasn't done this. Look at how divided like the political situations are in the world, and the ways in which we perhaps fundamentally see different realities or live in different social realities. Far from being this thing that brings unity, we know that technology is a specific presentation of the world around us. So much so that the first law of technology proposed by Melvin Kranzberg in 1985, and I would thoroughly recommend reading this whole document of Melvin Kranzberg's Laws of Technology from the 1980s, because they're really interesting to where we are much later on, where we are 40 years later. But Kranzberg's first law, as he proposed it, is that technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. He says, by that I mean technology's interaction with social ecology is such that technical developments frequently have environmental, social, and human consequences that go far beyond the immediate purposes of these technical devices and practices themselves. It's that idea of technology never being neutral that I guess I want to dwell on a little bit here to establish some of the theoretical foundations of our thinking through and with AI. In particular, I want to do it through Baudrillard and his idea of hyperreality. Jean Baudrillard was a really interesting thinker, a very grumpy thinker, a very cynical thinker about media and its potential in our world. But I think a really important thinker for where we are here in 2025. And I guess his brand of post-structural thinking or postmodern thinking, or however we want to position these terms, is particularly useful for understanding the distance between AI's view of reality and the lived social reality, if there can be such a thing. The reason I guess I've got traditor, I'm originally trained as a linguist, and I think that phrase is really interesting. It suggests that it's an Italian phrase that doesn't quite translate, and it means to translate is to betray, or a translator is a betrayer, or something in the middle of it. Doesn't quite work in English, it works much better in Italian. The idea of translating from one reality to another is always an act that emphasizes some voices, emphasizes some perspectives, and will minimize others. It's a representation, to borrow a phrase from Stuart Hall, it's a representation of our reality into a new reality. And Baudrillard's thinking suggested that that reality had started to take over our lived realities. So to sort of introduce Baudrillard very quickly, in Simulation and Simulacra, which is a fascinating book I would recommend you all reading, Baudrillard talks about Jorge Luis Borges's extremely short story that's here on the right-hand side, on exactitude in science. In it, you can read it, it's just a paragraph, but Borges describes an empire whose map is made the size of that of the empire, and which coincides point for point with it. It was a map that was literally the size of an empire, and over time, this impossibly large map becomes part of the landscape. The representation and the thing being represented become confusingly one and the same. For Baudrillard, this is an imperfect but useful allegory for the simulation of what he calls hyperreality, a reality constructed of images which represent but also mask reality. The real, he said, has been murdered by an endless stream of images. I think in particular, this is a really interesting way of thinking about our reality, because it suggests that AI has suggested a new reality to us. It is laying out a map of our world and asking us to accept that as an accurate depiction of the world around us. I'm going to show you a quick quote from Baudrillard so you can get a sense of how he writes. And for those who don't know, I guess Simulation and Simulacra, and particularly these sort of quotes, inspired the movie The Matrix, and make of that what you will. But he suggests, abstraction today is no longer that of the map, the double, the mirror, or the concept. Simulation is no longer that of a territory, a referential being, or a substance. In this, it is the generation by models of a real without original reality, a hyper-real. The territory no longer precedes the map, nor survives it. Henceforth, it is the map that precedes the territory. It is the map that engenders the territory, and if we were to revive the fable today, it would be the territory whose shreds are slowly rotting across the map. It is the real and not the map whose vestiges subsist here and there in the desert, which are no longer those of the empire but our own. As I said, he had this knack of very dramatic writing, but what he's trying to get at behind it is that it is becoming easier, or as he might say, more seductive, to think of real life as images on screen, as prompts, as texts, of ways of seeing the world, as a translation, without understanding the lexical gaps, the gaps between the original reality and the translated reality. It's this idea of perhaps AI being a hyper reality, trying to sell us a reality more real than our own reality, that I want to keep coming back to throughout this presentation. So let's zoom out from there, and I'll run through a few other perspectives and implications of this idea of a tension between different realities. But I guess I want to start with the idea of who AI talks to and for and of. You might notice in the background of this presentation, there are a bunch of images of AI produced by AI and young people in a zine that I produced that's not going to show up very well, called What's at Stake. I'll put a link to it in this presentation. But these images are all made from young people and their thoughts around AI, which we'll talk more about in the next presentation. But I want to talk a little bit about some of the work coming out of the field of education, and why technology has this inherent bias in it. One of the best thinkers for this for me is Tracy Cottom. Much of the work, I guess, in EdTech and in digital sociology as a whole and cultural studies of technology has been led by Black scholars in the field, so the like of Timnit Gebru, Tracy Cotton, Safia Noble, Francesca Sabande, Andre Brock Jr., Joy Bulawame, many others that I would happily put together a little bit of a reading list on that I think is particularly interesting and useful here. But Tracy, in a book called Digital Sociologies, I have a chapter in that book, it's nowhere near as good as hers, but she says educational technology is often designed with what she calls a roaming autodidact in mind, a user who is self-motivated, able learner that is simultaneously embedded in technocratic futures and disembedded from place, culture, history, and markets. The roaming autodidact is almost always conceived as Western, white, educated, and male. And as a result of designing for this roaming autodidact, we end up with a platform, and here she's talking about educational platforms, that understand learners as white and male and measure their task efficiency against an unarticulated norm of Western male whiteness. It's not an affirmative exclusion of poor students or bilingual learners or Black students or older students, but it need not be affirmative to be effective. I often come back to this quote in much of my teaching about the ways in which educational technology is excluding different voices or excluding different ways of seeing the world. And AI works much in this same way of seeming to suggest a broader understanding of reality or a cohesive understanding of reality, but emphasizing some perspectives and minimizing others. And this sneaks into a whole bunch of aspects of our social world in a very interdisciplinary way that I want to unpack just a little bit with you all. So, as I get lost in my Zoom, one of the ways in which it's done this is through job markets. We can see a lot of hiring practices that start to use AI in interesting and worrying ways. So, for example, hiring practices have started to use AIs that drift towards a bias, even if they aren't necessarily trained in doing that or trained to do that, because the underlying performance data these algorithms are trained on is marred by sexism, racism, structural biases already present in the job market. And so we start to see AI that represents this inequality back at the job market. And when AI is used to, say, sift CVs or select CVs to invite for interview, we start to see these biases crop up. So, for example, Amazon's system that it was trialing with AI and CVs taught itself that male candidates were preferable and penalized resumes that included the words women, as in women's chess club captain, and downgraded graduates who went to all women's schools and so on. These programs, it says here, there was no guarantee that the machines would not devise other ways of sorting candidates that could prove discriminatory. And to me, that idea of these technologies reflecting back our biases at us, and the quote at the bottom has an example of this as well, where it favored names such as Jared, an applicant who played high school lacrosse. The fact that it might suggest these biases back at us as neutral ways of seeing the world, as unpolitical ways of seeing the world, is particularly worrying. And it suggests to me that we have to question the sorts of assumptions made by AI rather than just taking it on its face value. Researchers like Richard Hex and others argue that we should move on from talking of digital inequalities through a lens of who does and doesn't have access, and instead start to consider the ways in which, once we have access to technologies, it still harms specific communities, specific voices. And I guess much of the push from social sciences and from other fields has been getting more people online, getting more access, increasing the access to technology. But that alone is not going to fix some of these inherent issues in technology. I mentioned Some of the voices who have spoken on this, perhaps the most useful for this presentation that I would recommend you all go read, is Safia Noble's book, Algorithm of Oppression. In it, she documents the ways in which not only the design of the technology, but crucially, the cultures that produce Google search in this case, or Facebook or other platforms, reinforce specific narratives of sort of a deficit around race that positions she often talks about the ways in which it positions blackness as peripheral to an assumed normative whiteness of the internet. So, for example, she writes in this book about the ways in which Silicon Valley present campaigns designed to get Black girls into coding, which serve to sort of render Blackness as a non-technical space and express the idea that Black people do not belong in technology. For a thorough response to that, I would thoroughly recommend reading Andre Brock's work around Blackness and technology. But I'm going to show you a quick quote from Safia Noble to kind of drive this idea home. She says, by rendering people of color as non-technical, the domain of technology belongs to whites and reinforces problematic conceptions of African Americans. This is only exacerbated by framing the problems as pipeline issues instead of an issue of racism and sexism, which extends from employment practices to product design. Black girls need to learn how to code. Code is an excuse for not addressing the persistent marginalization of Black women in Silicon Valley. My image obscures my slide. There is a way I can fix that. Let me just get around to fixing that. Thank you for letting me know. Give me 2 seconds and I will change the way that I'm sharing my screen, see if that makes it better. I'm hoping that makes it a little bit better so that it's not just my face in the corner. Hopefully now you can see the full screen. I think it's this default position of design as like the domain of whiteness and the domain of brilliant, thanks Jessica, the sorts of sensibilities of technology that encourage what Andre Brock says is the rhetorical narrative of whiteness as the normality here. And for me, that idea that she talks about of search being political can extend to the recent sort of discussions of algorithmic recommendations as inherently political as well. I think we should aim to understand AI as a space of politics that attempts to renegotiate the relationship between self and identity and who we are and what is central to a range of different discussions that you can ask it on. It's a site of struggle around design. In particular, I would suggest here for people interested in research that there's a need to create research that presents and explores the sort of logics of these algorithmic decisions and the ways in which they normalize certain ways of acting, certain bodies, certain voices. It will continue to influence different parts of our lives. AI is going to continue to be present. And so the sort of abstinence approach that I'm seeing some places take is not as useful as a sort of critical discussion of it. And I think the social sciences and SENSS and other places are the most important place to begin these critical discussions, and often where these discussions are being had incredibly loudly. We have to work on how to get this into other fields, but social sciences offer us theoretical tools to do this. Let me shift out a little bit here, zoom all the way out and talk about another theoretical lens we can look at here. So as well as this idea of inequalities, not just in terms of access, but the ways in which technology pervades a sort of specific view of the world. I want to present a bit of a theoretical foundation from this from an interdisciplinary lens. And for me, one of the most useful spaces for thinking about the tensions between technology and design and users is through human geography. So I'm going to talk a little bit very quickly about the work of Henri Lefebvre and his writings exploring the reproduction of social space. I often find I've written a book about design and technology, and it feels like human geography is miles ahead of the rest of social sciences in talking about design in a really interesting way. Gosh, this is quite blurry, but Lefebvre argues that and he wrote from sort of a Marxist position here in his background, but he argues that we can understand space not as a physical thing, but as something that is constantly reproduced by the relationship between the spatial practices, so how that space is perceived by often the designers of that space, so their intent for that space, the representational space, so the lived everyday reality of that space, and the sort of discourse, the representations of that space. So things like maps and signs and different things that tell us who is and isn't allowed in a given space. This model is really useful, as well as perhaps a bit methodologically obscure to everybody. But these three elements are sort of in tension with each other. The designer's intent may be in tension with the sort of user's action of a space. The ways in which we conceive of a space may be in tension with our day-to-day uses. All of these parts constantly shift to create a social space in an ongoing way. I want to give you a few concrete examples of this. One that's often shared is anti-homeless technologies that are put into social spaces. And the point of these technologies is, so for example, this is a bench at the bottom picture in Camden. For those of you who want to use it as a bench, it may not affect your day-to-day use of it. You may not really notice what this bench is doing, but for those who need to use it for a different purpose, such as sleeping on, you can suddenly see that this bench is not designed to be slept on, or the spikes on the side of buildings in London are not designed to be slept on. They're designed to keep specific uses out of that space. Another example that I often use in my lectures is from around Norwich. I would normally ask my students to guess what these images all have in common. I will spoil it for you here. Throughout Norwich, we have a bunch of old buildings and a lack of public toilets. So what they did to fix this wasn't build public toilets, but to build these odd shapes into the sides of all of the buildings in Norwich that are designed to splash if someone's urinating in them, designed to force people to stand out into the streets so they can't stand in a corner. You get these little fences that are designed at sort of waist height to impale anybody standing there. Throughout Norwich, if you need to urinate, you can't because there's no public loos. There are now, they've gotten better with this. But there's a bunch of technology designed to stop specific uses of those spaces. To me, those sort of tensions between designer and user are really interesting, and they don't necessarily dictate how we use that space. We can find ways to get around this, but they suggest certain paces or certain bodies that are or aren't allowed in there. To go back to AI and to go back to leading Black scholarship in this field, I mentioned Ruha Benjamin earlier and Joy Bilawami. Joy Bilawami talks, and her biography here, Unmasking AI, to me is again a really essential read. She talks about what she terms the coded gaze, G-A-Z-E, in AI systems, ways in which AI encodes discrimination and how different communities are excoded, so removed from that data set. And Joy Bilawami talks in particular about the ways in which these technologies have been trained on what she calls pale male data. So the de facto view, again, as Tressie was talking about, of these technologies as persisting a sort of white male view of the world. We've seen this in sort of medical data as well, and in the sort of ways in which these technologies sort of harmlessly or seemingly harmlessly present sort of relatively mundane assumptions. This is why I've got Ruha Benjamin here on screen as well. In Race After Technology, a fascinating book, please read it as well. I'll produce a full reading list at the end of this, there's so much to read. She talks about hand sensors on soap that don't pick up brown skin. And she talks here, let me read this quote to you. She says, "There's a straightforward explanation when it comes to a soap dispenser. Infrared technology requires light to bounce back from a user and activate the sensor. So skin with more melanin absorbs as it does more light, absorbing as it does more light does not trigger the sensor. But this strictly technical account says nothing about why this particular sensor mechanism was used, whether there are other options which recognize a broader spectrum of skin tones, and how this problem was overlooked during development and testing as well before the dispenser was installed." Like segregated water fountains of a previous era, the soap dispenser offers a window into a wider social terrain. It's those tensions between design and designer that I think are particularly interesting and useful. It came up in that project that Richard has kindly shared in the chat, my zine that we did, exploring how young people felt about AI. In that, there was a tension between what they wanted to look at and how they wanted to talk about AI and what AI would talk about. We did a bunch of experiments, a bunch of workshops with young people to ask them their thoughts on AI whilst the UK elections were going on. And some of the young people were out doorstepping for Tory candidates, and some of them were fervent Labour supporters. And all they wanted to do was to get the AI to talk about the political situation, and it wouldn't do it unless they found ways to get around it. And they did find ways to get around it. So, for example, one of them asked the AI to explain Tiananmen Square with emojis because it wouldn't explain it in text. And so they managed to find this sort of imperfect explanation of Tiananmen Square from Microsoft Copilot in an emoji form. To me, that sort of suggests that it is pushing a certain view of the world, but that view of the world is in tension with the sort of creative ways in which we might push back against these different technologies. I'm going to zoom back out because I've got a couple more things that I wanted to chat through before I hand over. As I mentioned, these are just quick dives into different theoretical perspectives that are all kind of pulling at this idea of what reality AI is presenting to and for and about us. As I've mentioned, this idea of inequality is kind of at the heart of a lot of the discussions about technologies. And as I've mentioned, that's not just in terms of access to these technologies, but also the ways in which they persist to suggest certain biases. One area that's done this quite a lot is in health research. And in SENSS, we get quite a few applicants exploring different fields of health, some of which might suggest using AI to relieve health issues. And there's certainly a lot to say about the ways in which AI might help spot certain issues or train us. There's a lot of potential of it, but also there's a lot of research, again, around bias in health algorithms. So this is from Obermeter's work et al. In Science. They say racial biases reduce the number of Black patients identified for extra care by more than half. Biases occur because the algorithms use health costs as a proxy for health needs. Less money is spent on Black people, Black patients who have the same level of need, and the algorithm falsely concludes that Black patients are healthier than equally sick white patients. It makes assumptions based on the data we give it. It makes assumptions based on what we train it on, and so it starts to reproduce these assumptions back at us. Simply improving these technologies and improving access to these technologies, in particular, is not going to be enough to address these inequalities and these concerns. There's one bit that I did want to focus on in particular, which is that once we try and detoxify these AI systems, so these large language models, that doesn't necessarily fix the inequalities as well. So this is a quote from Johannes Welb's work in detoxifying language models, and they suggest that once we try and detoxify language models that train AI, that AI use, this comes at the cost of reduced coverage for both texts about and dialects of marginalized group, which seems to suggest that AI doesn't know how to talk about marginalized groups if it's not in a toxic manner, and that the only frame of reference for discussion of marginalization is one that perpetuates inequality. I'll give you an example of this in action. This was kind of widely covered at the time, but it's something I keep coming back to as an example of this sort of flattening of diversity and the homogenization of different cultures. So this is a selection of photos from Midjourney of time travelers showing warriors and soldiers taking selfies. And it shows samurai warriors and French World War I soldiers and ancient Egyptians and Aztecs all taking selfies huddled together around a camera. And one of the, I guess, best bit of writings about this that I found in the discussion afterwards was from Jenna Gerfinkel, who talks about this and suggests, as I zoom into his teeth, this concept of a facial expression, she's quoting someone else here, the first part implies an internal feeling that seeks release in a set of facial movements. But she says, in flattening the diversity of facial expressions of civilizations around the world, AI has collapsed the spectrum of history, culture, photography, and emotion concepts into a singular monolithic perspective. It's presented a false visual narrative about the universality of something that in the real world, where real humans have lived and created cultural expression and meaning for hundreds of years, hundreds of thousands of years, is anything but uniform. It seems a relatively, as does the hand dispenser and some of the other examples I've quoted here, seems relatively inconsequential until you add these up into a way of understanding that these technologies do not know how to see the world if it's not through a specific lens of specific politics of society. Excludes diverse ways of navigating the world, of experiencing the world, of seeing the world around us, and sort of continues inequalities that persist in the world around us. I think I've driven this home quite a lot in this presentation, so I don't want to dwell on it too much, but I think we need to think of ways of theorizing and capturing the lived harms that these technologies might do to different communities and to different bodies. One of the best fields for doing this, and one of the best areas of doing this, is things like crypt theory and the work of Rob McCrure and others in disability studies, who combine queer studies and disability studies to think about how specific expectations of the world are coded into these devices. I thoroughly recommend checking out crypt theory if you're interested in this through a particularly disability rights perspective, but more broadly, a perspective of how specific times and specific understandings of space are placed upon different bodies through technology. One more quick diversion into what I think is perhaps the most interesting thing for us as social scientists, and then I'll open up for some discussions and questions. Thanks for sticking with this. The last thing I wanted to talk about is a slight crisis we're getting in data. So as well as sort of these coded inequalities, these tensions between designers and users, and the sorts of ways an AI might speak for different communities or of or to or about different communities, there's also a crisis in the sort of data that is being used to code these technologies. We're predicted to run out reliably human accurate data for AI by 2026, which to me is kind of worrying in that AI might, traditionally AI until recently this year was trained on data from before 2001, because that was the time at which AI started producing its own data, its unreliable data, its false data into the world. And so it couldn't train itself on its own produced data. So it was slowly becoming obsolescent. As it suggests here, we argue that synthetic data generation, transferring learner from data-rich domains and data efficiency improvements might support this, but we've had research that suggests that AI models collapse when they're trained on recursively generated data. So even if we train AI off of itself, the models start to collapse in different ways. So we're at this space where it struggles with data produced after 2001, and it looks like we might run out of reliable public data for it to be trained on in 2026, which is coming up quite quickly. This all creates a slight crisis in data, but I guess from a sociological perspective, I wanted to dwell a little bit on what is missing in the data sets. There's a bit of art that's often cited here as an example of this, which is Mimi Anuha's Library of Missing Data Sets. It's a really impactful bit of art, which is a filing cabinet full of data that we haven't collected. So data like publicly available gun trace data, or causes of the Black church fires, or locations of specific communities or public conservatives that have engaged in homoerotic activity. All of these very politically charged terms that we don't have data on, or that we haven't collected data about. So we know that AI is already trained on a limited data set. We know that there's also a lack of data. And in some ways, that lack of data for it to be trained on is also quite political. For a full discussion of this, I would thoroughly, again, recommend another book, which is Kevin Guyan's Queer Data, which talks about how we collect and use data on queer communities, and in particular, how there are choices made by queer communities about what to give data on and what not to give data on, both in the ways that data can be harmful and helpful. There's a full quote here, which I haven't got quite time to read, but I would say the important thing is that he suggests, in my working with universities, as with other large organizations, I saw how practitioners tasked with data collection could lose sight on what data meant and focus attention on fixing the numbers rather than the problems the data was intended to represent. So even when we have AI trained on a lot of data, we know that it's missing some data sets, perhaps purposefully at times, those political data sets, but it's also collecting specific data and missing gaps in its understanding of, for example, as Kevin's work points out, specific bits of queerness. Kevin gave a fascinating talk at the Edinburgh AI Summit last summer. You can see my head in the front of it bobbing up and down very happily as he's talking, but it was called Facebook Knew I Was Gay Before I Did. And it goes through this idea of how AI collects data on queerness and what is missing and present in those data sets. It's a really thoughtful look at different data sets, and I would thoroughly encourage you to have a look at it. I'm going to zoom in a little bit and just present one last version of this that popped up in that AI study, and then I will stop. So we worked with a school in Edinburgh that was a special educational needs school with a bit of AI technology that was created specifically for pupils experiencing special educational needs. So this was an AI designed to address a specific need in a disabled community. And this minimally verbal pupil asked the AI to create an image of him and his friend. He wrote Robert and Colin smiling, and Robert and Colin friends. And the AI kept coming back with this image of two white kids, which did not fit Robert's race, but did fit Colin's. And he kept getting upset because this AI would only show two young white boys as friends. Robert and Colin were coded as white names, and it would only show him these. So even in a technology that was designed to alleviate inequalities, particularly around disability, it had continued to misunderstand him and present a specific view of the world back to him as if it was the only way of viewing the world. Young people that we worked with specifically said that they wanted to labor, they wanted to struggle against these technologies, they wanted to learn in a way that wasn't reduced or flattened. Here's a protest image that one of them created, quoting Albert Camus and the myth of Sisyphus, and they say the struggle itself towards the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. I must imagine myself happy. The original quote is, I must imagine Sisyphus happy, pushing a boulder up a hill, struggling, but joy being in that labor, in that creation, in that continual work. I would encourage you to think about like what work we're asking AI to do and what AI asks of us, because it doesn't remove labor, it creates new labors. And some of those labors are particularly worrying, particularly gendered, particularly racial, and particularly political. Let me not talk to you about that last thing. I will zoom out and point out I have a book coming out on this. My publishers would be very happy if I promoted it, called Researching Digital Society, an Introduction, which goes through many of these ideas today and specifically talks about the impact of methodology for some of these theoretical concepts. Feel free to pre-order once pre-orders are out. I think somewhere in the summer, it's coming out in November, but happy to come and talk about that once the book is out. But thank you all for letting me ramble at you a little bit about some of these ideas. Happy to answer questions or take thoughts or ideas from any of you. And I'll share the link to the Prezi so you can zoom in and out to your heart's desire and see all the quotes that I've got there. But yeah, does anyone have any questions or thoughts or anything they wanted to raise? Please share your references in the papers you've cited, as your slides do not indicate the details of the publications. Marcia, I will happily do so.
Harry, well, no. Thank you so much for this talk and all the incredible background about the social and the economic dynamics and underpinning these models. I wonder if we have students here that maybe wonder, okay, but on a practical term, what does this mean in terms of how I should use these tools? Kind of practical. I understand what you say, but in terms of practical guidance regarding when they're considering to use these tools, what things might they consider or prioritize, like use it in this context, not in that one? Ask yourself this question.
Yeah,
Something like that, if that makes sense.
I think it's really important, and part of this comes down to the whole idea of literacies and particularly AI literacies, and understanding how prompts we give it might give us specific answers. Particularly, we're thinking here in terms of research methods of using these as a tool for analysis or a tool for coding or whatever else. If you use, for example, Teams automatic coder of language, it will remove certain mannerisms, certain affects, certain linguistic choices and present like a standard English version of it. Those are choices to present words in specific ways. And as researchers, we can read through that and think of what it is presenting to us or what it has chosen to remove, what map of the empire it's produced for us and what that normalizes. So I think it requires extra labor. It requires us to be critical and thoughtful. I don't think that's a bad thing. It's just being aware of these as non-neutral devices that I think is so important to digital research and all social science research.
Hi, may I
Hey,
ask a question? Hi.
please.
If the data is not reliable, do
Mm.
you have any suggestions of how to, like going forward, input the data in order for it to be more representative?
Yeah, again, I would point you to Kevin Guyan's work here.
Okay. Yeah.
In particular, he talks about the ways in which we might not want to give it certain data sets because we're not sure what it would do with that data. There's a bunch of really interesting activist movements, including wiki editathons that go around adding new information to Wikipedia and giving it in wiki editathon started up as this sort of feminist space to increase the presence of female voices on Wikipedia and articles about women. So there are ways of training it up on specific data sets or increasing the data that it has. Kevin makes a case for creating our own data sets or being thoughtful about the data sets we use and what we give to things like AI. So it may be the case that we have to go and create our own data sets and report on that data, or perhaps the absence of the data, as Mimi Anuha's artwork suggests. So it's never a clean answer as to what we can do to increase or de-bias the data, because as I suggested, even when we try and correct for it, it seems to produce bias. It tells us something about our social world and about the design of AI. But it's about being thoughtful with our data sets and understanding the limitations of that data. So it might be that we have an old school data set, like libraries of zines or protest songs, or there's different ways of collecting and understanding these things. Does that answer it?
Yes. Yeah. I'm just aware of what's going on in America, for example, and various things being destroyed that are irreplaceable. There was some pointed to sort of military record or record of Afro-Americans, and
Shirley, you're
laid on
breaking
top of
up on
that,
us, I
sort
think.
of sorry, laid on top of, I don't know if she's laid on top of that, this idea of
I think we
in the
lost you,
wrong
Shirley.
hand. Okay. Okay.
While Shirley tries to rejoin us, and do feel free to put your question in the chat. Did anybody else want to come in? I'm not sure what happened to our connection there, Shirley, with you. Unfortunately, we lost you at some point.
I do have a question, if we still have some
Yeah, go
time,
ahead,
otherwise I
Giovanna.
can nail later. So maybe I'm more on the theoretical side again, and I was wondering if you already have any thoughts on the fact of how the systems are being trained, and
Yeah.
and our language, and how the language kind of again represents the word and organize how I think about this word, where there is any scope for us to think about how can I say, colonization again of knowledge,
Mhm.
but not only based on, how can I say, aspects that we already seen people working to code and so on, but like on the fact of the structure of the language that it has been mainly trained. How can I say, we are, yeah, what on that level. I'm not sure if the idea came across.
No, I think you're right. Yeah, in many ways, it sort of reflects the specific language that it's used on. We know, for example, like I think like 90% of the internet is in English, and it might, again, unthinkingly present that as a normative view of the world, or present a very, as Tracy says, Western white male understanding of the world back at itself as a normative, as a neutral position. When you push AI on these things, it does say, yeah, okay, I've done, but it doesn't seem to offer that data up unless you give it a sort of critical prompt. So yeah, I think it's, again, to the tension that Shirley was talking about of, do we give it more data? Do we hold back data? Data is being destroyed, data is being removed. None of these suggestions are perfect, and they all have implications for the sorts of language that it's going to produce, or the language that it normalizes, or the Overton window of acceptable and unacceptable words, or unacceptable thought. I think it's understanding AI as part of that discussion of translation, of lexical gaps, of what data it does and doesn't have. I think that's the important level we should be looking at it on. Yeah.
Thank
I think
you.
it's a good question to ask. I can see there's one more in the chat, which is as children use AI more and more to learn and lean on AI for help, do I have any opinion on what influences AI is it having? What influences AI is having on young people? And yes, I do. So in that Scottish Educational Summit, the thing I found interesting is they were asked young people, what are you using AI for? And rather than saying I'm using it to cheat on my homework, a lot of them said I'm using it to talk to someone I know isn't human, that won't judge me, won't tell me to shut up at the end of the day. If I'm rambling, it won't say, stop talking about this, or I'm not interested. They wanted to have this conversation, and they were having it with AI. I struggle to take a sort of position that AI is going to completely influence the lives of young people or completely structure it. But I think what was most interesting in the young people we talked to was that they were trying to have those discussions with AI as a sort of therapist, as someone to talk to, as someone to bounce ideas off of, and that AI wasn't really helpful in those discussions to them. That might suggest that we need to find other ways to structure those discussions to give them spaces to talk and share. But they also felt that it was too late for them, and that the younger generations were the ones that they needed to think about, because as a 15 to 16-year-olds, they were already so jaded and surrounded by this technology that they thought there was no escape for their lives. I think showing them alternatives, showing them ways in which there are positions for them, there are spaces for them in the world beyond AI, I think is important. Yeah, I'll talk about all of that much more at my next one, where I talk about the zines and on research zines, because I can see Noreen has a question in the chat. So next lecture, I will talk to you about how to produce zines and how to work with those, because I think it's important as well.
Thanks so much, Harry. Thank you, everybody. We're at the end of our session today. As Harry said, we've got other sessions coming up. Jenny, can you remind us when the date of the next session is, please, in our series?
So the next one is on the 30th of April at 2 o'clock.
And I believe that is with Kevin McDonald, is that
Yeah.
right? And this is kind of, yeah, go ahead.
Topic exploration, research idea generation, and evaluation, fine-tuning research questions.
Wonderful. Hope to see many of you again there. And just a huge thanks to you, Harry, for a fantastic session today. And thank you all for being with us. And as a reminder, the recordings for all these sessions will be uploaded to the SENSS YouTube site, so do look out for it there. And hope you all have a great rest of your afternoon and get to enjoy some of this lovely sunshine. Take care and see you all again soon.